There's a tale of two Easters that illustrates the change management opportunity and challenge inherent of hybrid ministry. Let's look back at Easter 2020. Chances are your service that Sunday was virtual. I know it wasn't mine. We had no problem getting congregation members to submit videos of themselves saying, "Hallelujah, he is risen." Those videos were part of a video compilation of our members celebrating Easter from their homes or wherever they were on that Sunday morning. When I think about Easter 2020, I think about enthusiasm. It was just a few weeks into the pandemic, and though things had closed down, energy was still high. People were still willing to go through the effort to try a new way of being church. So even though we sang Jesus Christ is risen today in our living rooms instead of our sanctuaries, in many ways, that digital church service still felt like Easter morning. I sat on that couch that morning, eating a chocolate rabbit, watching the Easter service next to my wife, next to my daughter, and it was a joyful morning. Though it was a dreary April day here in Wisconsin, the weather was cold and it was raining, we still felt the rebirth and resurrection promises on that Sunday. We'll come back to that in just a few moments, because Easter 2021 presented a little bit of a different scenario. Now, when we think about the transformation to hybrid ministry, we have to think of this as an adaptive leadership challenge, as a call to walk alongside our communities in a journey towards a new way of being church that equips and invites individuals into the life of the community. The best way that we can think of hybrid ministry and explain hybrid ministry to our community is by starting with its purpose. Now, usually when we talk about hybrid ministry, when we talk about the church online, we like to start with the tactics. We'll talk about live streaming worship. We'll talk about having Bible study on Zoom. We'll talk about having discussions in Facebook groups. But right now, we need to find a different way. We need to consistently articulate the purpose and the big why of this new way of being church. There's a leadership expert that I am particularly fond of reading. His name is Simon Sinek, and he devised one of the simplest yet most clever leadership and change tools that I've ever seen. It's called the Golden Circle, and Sinek suggests that most changes, most ways we try to approach community and approach the way we do things tend to start with the what's. We start with the tactics. We start with the specifics. As it turns out, though, our brains don't really care about the tactics and the specifics. Our brains need purpose. They need a story. They need a why. So Simon Sinek devised this tool, this illustration of how to guide a community through change that was a circle with a concentric ring. At the center of the circle is purpose, or the big why. According to Sinek, when we start a change process by thinking about the purpose, we engage individuals in a narrative or a story that they're likely to be willing to try. Now, outside of the purpose is the how we do the change. And we'll talk about the how of hybrid ministry in just a minute. And at the far outside of Simon Sinek's model, we have the what's, the tactics of hybrid ministry. Now, Sinek's work would tell us that when we talk to our community about the tactics, they're going to pay very little attention, they're not going to care, and their enthusiasm is going to quickly wane. But if we start with the purpose or the why, they'll lean in. They may be even willing to get involved. So for Sinek's model, putting that in the context of hybrid ministry, we've already talked about our purpose. Our purpose is to be equipping and inviting at the same time. We haven't actually talked about our how. Our how in a context of hybrid ministry is the idea of creating parity of experience. so that whether I'm connecting to my church online or offline, I still feel valued. I feel like an equal member of my church community, whether I find my faith through Facebook or through the walls of the sanctuary. And the what's we could talk about ad nauseum, those live streaming technologies, the Zoom Bible studies, the Facebook discussions. Having said that, let me take a few moments to talk about the how we create a bridge, how we create parity of experience. Because when we talk about the how in the context of hybrid ministry, we align to Simon Sinek's Golden Circle model, and it becomes that much more likely that our community will be willing to go along with this change. And to illustrate that example, I'm going to give you 3 specific illustrations of what hybrid ministry can look like in the context of worship, faith formation, and church leadership. Now let's start with worship. How do we create a bridge in worship between the online and the offline? How do we build that bridge? How do we create that parity of experience? Well, for some churches, it'll look like having a big media team, having a production budget, having fancy cameras and soundboards and mixing tools. The reality, though, is most churches simply don't have access to those resources. So what do? I would suggest that arguably the most important way and the most scalable, sustainable way for us to create parity of experience is simply with the language we use. As church leaders, when we're at the front of the service, are we talking to those who are gathered both online and in person? When we share the announcements, are we sharing information about how to connect to an event digitally and face-to-face? When we do the prayers of the people, are we specifically lifting up the prayer concerns of those who are gathered virtually? And have we found some way to hear those prayer concerns, to document them so that they can be read as part of our weekly petitions? When it comes to worship, we build the bridge not by fancy technologies, but by simple inclusive language that reminds our communities that whether they're on Facebook, YouTube, or in our sanctuary, they're all a part of the same worship experience. Now, parity of experience is actually a little bit different in the context of faith formation and in the context of church leadership. And faith formation is obviously something that's very important to the life of the church, especially in the Lutheran tradition. Our confirmation programs spanning 3 years are in many ways the envy of the church world seeking to connect with youth. Similarly, adult education opportunities, Bible studies, and book studies have always been so central to our life together as church. Building a bridge between the online and the offline in the context of education is about asynchronous engagement. How can we use digital tools to provide access to learning, whether somebody can make it at the date and time and location that we're gathered together, or whether they're unable to, and they need to learn at their own pace? Creating that bridge in faith formation means posting resources, learning paths, podcasts, blog posts, and videos to social media. It means creating opportunities for asynchronous conversation, perhaps through text messaging, perhaps through Facebook. Building that bridge is so important because it makes clear the message that learning can take place whether you're able to join us at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday night or whether another time best fits your schedule. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the how of building that bridge, creating that parity of experience in the world of church leadership. Now, every church has a different leadership structure. Some have big staff, some have hardly any staff, some have bustling offices, some just have a pastor who comes into a desk a few times a week. But whether we're big offices with large staff or small staff and no office at all, we can still practice the how of creating flexible work arrangements. of creating flexible leadership processes that allow people to contribute to the leadership of the church, whether they can be in the building at an appointed date and time or not. Now, that doesn't mean that every meeting has to have a Zoom dial-in or that all of our conversations need to happen over email. Rather, it means we should experiment with more flexible tactics, with more flexible models. Can we have an occasional work from home day or 2 days a week as a church staff? Can we commit to providing a conference dial-in or a Zoom call for church council and board meetings? Can we open up some of the work of those settings, our office work, our leadership and council-based work, to email or Slack, so we can get a little bit more done asynchronously, and so we can free up our time together for true purposeful engagement? Ultimately, the commitment that our church has to hybrid ministry and to the church's digital future is only as great as it's exemplified by our church leaders. If we're still working in an office 5 days a week, if our council is expected to be present physically and in person at 100% of all gatherings, then that implicitly says something about our commitment to the church's new normal. If we expect our congregations to engage in this way of being church that bridges the online and the offline, then it needs to start with leadership. Those are our hows for hybrid ministry. Parity of experience between the online and the offline, or building a bridge in both worship, in faith formation, and in church leadership. Now, what we haven't talked much about at this point are the whats, the specific tactics, how exactly we can do worship online and offline at the same time, how exactly we can create those asynchronous experiences with Christian education, or how we might create more flexible work arrangements for church leadership. We're going to come back to those ideas in just a moment. When we put these all together, the purpose of hybrid ministry being an effort to equip and to invite, the how of hybrid ministry, a parity of experience, and the tactics or the what of hybrid ministry, we fulfill all three levels of Simon Sinek's Golden Circle. As a result, our communities will be more likely to give it a try. They might be more likely to worship online on occasion. If not, perhaps they'll be willing to support our efforts to place a camera in the sanctuary, to welcome someone to our conversation who may not be in the same conference room, to work alongside our church leadership even if we're not sitting across the desk from one another. When we go to our congregations, we have to have all three of these layers established and a plan set for all three. Because as with any change, there will be some in our context who are likely to be glowing advocates for this new way of doing church. There are some who are likely to be indifferent and neutral. And there are likely to be a few who are a little reluctant and perhaps vocally and adamantly against this new way of doing church. It's important to fulfill all three of those levels of Sinek's Golden Circle because whether you're an advocate, whether you're indifferent, or whether you're reluctant, you still need to know the purpose for a change. Whether hybrid ministry is something that our congregations support and engage with or not depends on having that sense of purpose, that sense of process, that sense of practice. I want to go back to Easter for just a moment as we close out this conversation. And specifically, I want to fast forward to Easter 2021. Now, every church has reopened on a slightly different timeline. As I record this, some buildings have yet to reopen, some have been open for months. But in my church, the big reopening date was Easter morning, 2021. That morning, community members had a choice. They could worship online, they could join for a socially distanced outdoor service under a big tent, or they could join for a socially distanced indoor service in the walls of the sanctuary. It was effectively the first Sunday morning that we were back. People were thrilled. They were so excited to see one another for the first time in 13 months. They were so eager to get back to their way of being church community. Throughout that excitement, though, there were challenges. There weren't very many people to volunteer for the in-person service. There weren't that many people to run the equipment for live streaming so that we could still do church with Facebook and YouTube. We didn't have the volunteers in place. We didn't have the media team that we needed. There were some logistics that fell through the cracks. The pastors didn't necessarily show it, but I knew that Easter 2020 was an exhausting and perhaps frenetic morning, just as it was rewarding and uplifting to be together again. The change management challenge of hybrid ministry is so important because if we don't get this right, if we don't get our congregations bought in and involved, to be willing to watch, perhaps to be willing to volunteer to make these things possible, then we're adding to an already impossible to-do list that all church leaders have before them. Even before the pandemic started, the reality was that church leadership remains one of the most burnout-prone vocations in the United States. Most pastors report working somewhere between 55 and 60 hours per week. We have to start with purpose. We have to articulate the how, and we have to know our tactics. Because if we don't, we risk burning ourselves out. The internet is not going away. The opportunity to connect with our communities online is not going away. And there will always be the need to reach out to individuals like my grandma, who so badly could have used that connection to her church in the last years of our life. The question is, will we be able to sustain ourselves on this journey? Will we be able to walk alongside and coach our community to be right there with us? At this point, I'd just like to close by saying blessings to all of you. This is an incredibly exciting, and it's sometimes a little apprehensive moment for all of us. As you continue to lead the way into times unknown and into waters uncharted, may God bless you on your journey. In our time together today, we've talked a lot about the why or the purpose of hybrid ministry, to equip and to invite. We've also talked about the how of hybrid ministry, building a bridge or creating parity of experience between the online and the offline. We haven't talked much about the what's, the tactics, the brass tacks of hybrid ministry. We are still going to have that conversation, and we're going to have it together. I'd like to invite you to join us for 3 90-minute workshops taking place this summer live via Zoom. Those workshops will run on Thursday mornings, July 29th, August 5th, and August 12th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Whether you're a low-tech church or a high-tech church, whether you love technology or can't stand it, there will be something in those workshops for you. Workshop 1 will focus on worship, Workshop 2 on faith formation, Workshop 3 on church leadership and administration. In those sessions, we'll leave you with some concrete takeaways that matter to your ministry context. Bring your questions, bring your concerns, bring things your congregation is wondering about as we imagine what it means to be church in this digital age.